Welcome to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio, bringing you insights and strategies to help you create a magnificent and fulfilling second half of life. Here's your host, certified professional retirement coach and best-selling author, Dr. Dorian Mintzer.
I want to welcome everybody to today's Fourth Tuesday Revolutionize Your Retirement Interview with Expert series. I'm Dorian Mintzer, owner of Revolutionize Retirement and host for this program. I'm so delighted that today I have Doug Goldstein, who's a certified financial planner, and he's going to present the research that he's done over the past 5 years with world chess champion Susan Polgar about how high-level participants in any field often miss critical information in their decision-making process, and how investors can use the same strategies that the chess masters use in order to avoid common downfalls. Let me tell you about Doug. First of all, I met him because he actually interviewed me on his radio show, which is called Goldstein on Gelt Show. He interviewed me about the book that I co-wrote, The Couple's Retirement Puzzle, and I enjoyed talking with him so much, and I learned about this new book that just came out last month, and I said, Doug, I really want to interview you on my program and bring you to my audience. And so that's how this all came about. So I'm really delighted. Doug Goldstein is the co-author of the book Rich as a King, How the Wisdom of Chess Can Make You a Grandmaster of Investing. As I mentioned, he's a certified financial planner. He's a college lecturer, a radio show host. And when he started on Wall Street, his favorite client was his grandmother. She had been a stockbroker many years earlier. She was one of the first women to earn the license. And following in her footsteps, his mother also became an investment advisor, helping clients plan and build wealth throughout her 17-year career. Doug joined her as a partner in 1992, and the number one lesson that he learned from her was the importance of educating clients about handling their money wisely. And that's really the course of events that have taken Doug to where he is today. He's a 20-year Wall Street veteran and head of a major international financial services company, but views himself mostly as a financial educator. He writes extensively using easy-to-understand language so everyone can realize that investing isn't only for the professionally trained. He also writes newspaper columns and is author of 4 other books, teaches college courses, and hosts a personal finance radio show, which, as I mentioned, is called Goldstein on Gelt Show. And all of that led to this latest book. And I just want to comment that I've read the book, and it's really helpful. I'm not a avid chess player. I play chess. My son and husband are much better at it than me. But I have to say it's really easy to use concepts. And if you're really into chess, there's some segments that can really be helpful in terms of your chess game. But the concepts are really helpful in terms of just thinking about you and your financial life. I'm really delighted, Doug, to have you with us. And maybe we can just start with you just telling us a little bit more about what got you into this. And I think it's so interesting that it's the women in your life, grandmother and mother. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, and then we can proceed.
Dori, thank you. First of all, thank you very much. I'm honored to be here, and I'm really excited that we have a whole group of people listening, not the least of which is my mother, who is online with us, and I would say taught me everything I know. I think one of the most important things that people really forget is that in the business of making money, and so often people are focused on how am I going to pay for retirement and how am I going to pay to help my kids go to school, is they get so focused on the numbers and they really begin to forget about the people behind it all. And I know it's funny as a money guy to say, but I really think there's a lot more to handling money than just being a bean counter and seeing how much you have.
I have to say it's delightful to hear you as a financial planner say that, because many people on the call are life planners without the financial backing or training, and many of the people on the call have probably accessed help from both financial planners and life planners, and it's wonderful when they're financial planners that look at the holistic view. So I think it's great to hear.
Yeah. And that's what's really important. In fact, that's the lead-in, I suppose, to a lot of what I'd like to talk about. In fact, Dory, what I want to talk about today is a big part of what I spoke about at a professional conference very recently in Switzerland. My co-author, Susan Polgar, and I had the opportunity to speak at a conference for money managers and people who manage ultra-high net worth families. And when I was speaking about it, I was actually more looking forward to talking with you and your group because I felt so much of the information that I was giving was really much more relevant to your team. And although we framed it for the professionals, I'd like to share a number of the ideas that we came up with that I hope will help people maybe make a few better decisions.
That would be great because I know I have a bunch of questions for you, but I think, as you said, you have a flow of these things and then it will lead. And I think I just really want to encourage people, ask your questions, make your comments, and I will do my best to integrate all of them into the call a little bit later. Go ahead, Doug.
Okay. Probably the biggest area of failure that I would say chess players have, as well as investors, is that people tend to just miss what's right in front of them. So what I'd like to do is to explain some of the problems that we found and then actually give the 5 tools that everyone should be using in order to improve their skills of observation. And talk for a second about what in the behavioral finance world people refer to as mental accounting. And there are a lot of ways of looking at it, and sometimes it's simply called the illusion of attention. And that's where people will look at one small part of their portfolio or one small section of their overall finances, and they miss the big picture. A great example of this is when I've seen investors, they may have $1 million portfolio, but they'll spend an hour of a meeting talking with me, analyzing 100 shares of stock that they own, rather than looking at the $950,000 other dollars, which we should really be focusing on them. And that's where I try to tell them to focus a little bit more. Where does this come out in chess? My co-author and I, Susan Polgar, as we've been doing our research and writing the book, we did play a number of games of chess, and frankly, that's where a lot of the good stories come from. And in one of the games we played, I was doing really well. Now, you should know I'm not a world champion. I am what I refer to as an avid chess player. Really like to play, but not a professional. But in this case, I was doing great. Her king was in the corner, and my queen was about to make checkmate, and I had the backup of all these pieces, and I was ready to go. And all of a sudden, her bishop swooped in from the other side of the board and captured my queen. And, Dory, as you might imagine, at the end of this, a move or two later, she said, "Doug, checkmate." In my chair, and I said, "Susan, what was my big mistake?" And she said, "Didn't you see my bishop was on the board right in front of you? And you have to look at the whole board." And this is funny in chess because the board is only like 12 inches by 12 inches. How can all the data is right in front of you. So I started bemoaning my fate, and she said, "Don't worry, let me show you something else." And she showed me another game she had played. For those of you who are not chess players, it doesn't even matter. This is a game that Susan played against a former world chess champion, Vasily Smyslov. By the 5th move of the game, she had her bishop right in the corner of the board there. 20 moves later, you can see her bishop is still there. That's the right board. And that's when she started using that bishop to literally destroy her opponent and win the game. And she said, "Doug, even professionals suffer from this illusion of attention. They think they see what's going on, but they just don't get it." And so let's go to the next slide. And let's realize that at all levels, whether you're a professional chess player or investor or doctor, you miss things that are right in front of you. How does this affect clients? For those of you who are either professional investment advisors or on the receiving end and you get some ideas, let me show you what I've seen happen a lot. Tell me if you've ever seen a mutual fund fact sheet that looks like this. It's usually a 2-page document, and the words on it don't really matter very much. And by the way, my disclaimer, of course, is that we're talking about a specific fund. This is in no way a recommendation to anyone for any specific investment. All investments you should speak to with a licensed investment advisor before you do anything. But what I found with clients is the first thing they'll look at is this fund is a 5-star fund, and they're very excited about it. And the other thing they might have seen on the mutual fund fact sheet was that if you invested $100,000, it grew to be about $248,000. And who wouldn't want that, right? Sounds great. Now let's see what the investors didn't see. So they didn't see that in order to grow from $100,000 to $250,000, this fund took about 20 years to do that. So obviously that's a very important fact that people have to realize, that people also never seem to bother to read the bold print that past performance is no guarantee of future returns. And even more so with this fund. By the way, this fund looks, the name is a short duration fund. It sounds like it's a relatively conservative fund. It points out that the figures you're looking at with this fund are based on the long-term performance of the fund, but about 7 years ago, the fund actually had a totally different investment style. So it was a different fund. And if you don't look at the big picture, and all of the information is right in front of you when you look at this mutual fund fact sheet, in the same way a chess player, all of the information is right in front of him when he's making his decisions about what to move, how do you miss this critical data? So we'll leave that question on the table for a minute, and let me tell you what I shared with the investment advisors I spoke to and what I share with clients all the time. I think the best way to envision yourself in handling your money is to step away and to see yourself as the CEO of a company. It happens to be a family company, and you could call it My Family Limited. And you have different divisions. You have the checkbook division that might handle the payments, and you have the bond unit, which deals with your income, and you'll have your equity team that looks for growth, and you could have many different teams. And if you like handling it yourself, so this is great. If you like working with a financial advisor, I'll often tell my clients to imagine you are the CEO of your company, and you just hire me as the CFO. I'm the Chief Financial Officer. But I still have to report to you. Ultimately, you have to make the decisions, but you have to look at things from the top down. And the fact is, it's very difficult for people to do that. And we see it not only, I showed you in the world of chess, and many of you have certainly probably witnessed this yourself, but you see it when people even look at their own investments. And there was a great study that was done at Harvard University. They showed radiologists a slide. Now, radiologists spend all their day looking at x-rays or various types of scans. And one of the most common slides they'll look at will be like the following one that I'd like to show you now.
So make sure you describe it for people who don't.
Okay. What we're looking at now is an actual slide that was taken as a cross-section of the lungs. And in the lungs, there are these little nodes that this is what radiologists look at. And in order to do this study, I hope the people who are looking at the screen now are beginning to laugh, because maybe they see something that's standing out in the middle of the screen there on the right side that looks exactly, what you're looking at there is 48 times the size of the average node that the radiologist would normally look at, and that is the image of a gorilla in the middle of the slide. And when the Harvard University researchers showed this slide to a group of radiologists, 83% of them did not see the gorilla. They didn't spot it. Now, can you imagine, these are the same people who are looking at your slides to decide if you have cancer, and they couldn't see a gorilla that was 50 times the size of everything else they were looking at. Not only that, the Harvard researchers looked at the eye movements of the radiologists and found that of those who didn't spot the gorilla that was right in the middle of the slide, half of them stared right at it, meaning they didn't recognize what was right in front of them. And frankly, I find this shocking. However, having now seen it happen with chess players who don't see a bishop that's right in front of their nose, and having watched it happen to investment clients every day when they don't see what's so obvious, for example, Mr. Smith, you're spending more money than you're earning, you're going to wipe themselves out, and people always have some rationalization why it's not true in their case. People just miss the obvious. So let me give you now, as we'll wrap up, and then we'll start taking some questions. I'd like to present 5 ideas that you might try to do in order to help you to get over this illusion of attention. And again, it's really critical to realize that don't feel bad. These aren't things that you should feel bad about yourself, that maybe you're missing it. I remember when I started on Wall Street, I was a pretty hard worker, and I used to stay late. And one day, my boss a very serious guy. He was staying late too. And I saw him standing by the shredding machine. He was standing by the shredding machine holding a piece of paper. And I went out to him and I said, "Sir, can I help you?" And he says, "Oh, Doug, I'm so happy you're here. I don't really know how to use this. Could you take care of this for me?" So I said, "Yes, sir." And I took the piece of paper. I stuck it in the machine and it got sucked in. He looked at me and he patted me on the back and he said, "Thank you very much, Doug. I only needed one copy." It was a very awkward conversation when he didn't realize we were standing in the shredding machine. And so it happens everywhere that people don't see what's going on. So the first thing that everyone, I think, should do is to get yourself either a coach, and the coach is a generic term in many ways. So it could be a financial planner, it could be a life coach, it could be a team member, it could be a family member, but someone else who you talk to whose opinion you will actually rely upon. Many times I've seen spouses, one of them pays lip service to the other. "Oh, yeah, what do you think?" and then just continues talking because they're not really a team. Quite frankly, I joke a lot that my job as a financial advisor is just as often as a marriage counselor. I'm just trying to help people to communicate with each other a little better. So the first thing you can do is to get a great coach. Obviously, if you're a chess player, you need a great coach. The second thing I would suggest is to do a post-mortem. Whenever you do a trade, whether it's a winning trade or a losing trade, whenever you change something in your finances, look back at what happened. The way that I got started in writing this book with Susan was two of my kids are chess champions, and they had a coach, and I used to sit in with their sessions, and one day we were analyzing one of my games. And the coach said to me, he said, "Doug, I see you put your bishop on this square, which was clearly a bad move. Why didn't you move it the next turn?" So I said, "Coach, I thought I would work on my pawns on the other side." So then the next turn we're analyzing. We're doing a post-mortem. He said, "Doug, your bishop was still badly placed. Why didn't you move it this time?" I said, "I wanted to develop my queen." And this discussion went on for a few moves, and I finally realized I sounded exactly like my clients when I asked them, "How come you're staying in overdraft?" or "How come you keep this 20% credit card debt?" or "Why are you holding this bad stock?" They always have some excuse. It's because they're not really looking. And so you have to take time and do a post-mortem and look back about what happened in order to make a much smarter decision. All right, let's look at point number 3. So we've said number 1 is get a coach. Number 2 is do a post-mortem. Number 3 is look to cross-pollinate. Look to take one idea and mix and match it with the other. And certainly in the investing world, I think that has a lot to do with putting together a portfolio which different assets and different asset classes like stocks and bonds, and hopefully they'll be somewhat non-correlated, which means even in your stock portfolio or your bond portfolio, you have subcategories, whether it's high-yield bonds or international bonds, or on the stock side, whether you'll have global stocks or U.S. stocks or large companies or small companies. You have to kind of mix it all together to make sure that you're not too focused in any one area. So that's point number 3, is cross-pollinating ideas. Let's take a look, and we'll talk about the importance of understanding whether you need to be examining your strategy or your tactics. And all too often, strategy is the big picture, the financial planning, I like to say, and tactics are making the little decisions, whether you should buy this or sell that. And the question that a lot of people ask, and in fact I ask Susan a lot, they say, if I want to become a great chess player, should I study strategy more or should I study tactics more? And it turns out that the same answer she gives them is the same answer I give clients, which is at the end of the day, if you're a good tactician, if you're good at moving your pieces around, even if you don't have the greatest strategy, you'll still be okay. Meaning, if you keep a careful budget and you diversify your portfolio and you do your regular savings, all these little tactics you can do over the years, you'll be fine. It's true you would be better if you had a good strategy, but don't spend all your time trying to come up with a strategy, and then if you think you're such a strategist, the problem is you'll often change your strategy mid-course way too often, and you'll never have a course, and you'll never really succeed. So if people are looking to succeed and they want to stop themselves from getting distracted by all the other information. Just focus on the simple moves you can do every day. And that leads to the very last idea, but I'll just tell you. Be very careful when you read the news. And one of the things that was a little embarrassing when I gave this speech to these money managers is that there was an editor from CNN there. So I had to apologize to him when I told him, listen, the people that are choosing the news that we read are the editors of the papers and the news services, and they're not doing it to make us better investment advisors or investors. They're doing it to sell newspapers. So there's always the shock value. So you really want to stay away from focusing so much on the news because, as we always like to tell people, the news causes you to lose. And the reason it does is because people they make decisions and they make moves so often based on what the headline is of the day. And statistically, the studies have been done that people who invest without the benefit of the news, people who invest in a news vacuum, actually outperform people who invest with the benefit of news. I'm talking about regular investors, not professionals. So watch out where you get your information from, and always second guess what you're seeing, and don't be changing your strategy too much. So those are the 5 things. Get yourself a coach. Review all of your decisions on a regular basis. Diversify your portfolio by cross-pollinating ideas. Understand there's a difference between strategy and tactics, and focus mostly on the tactics. And finally, watch out for the news because it's really what can mess you up. I just want to stress in today's conversation, if we do discuss any specific investments or ideas, please just take this as education and not as a specific bit of investment advice.
Great.
Okay, Dory, I hope that was useful. Huh?
Yeah, no, I think that was very helpful, and I realize you covered a number of the questions that I wanted to ask, but I want to go in more depth to some of them. But I think part of what I'm hearing that seems so important to think about is that we as the investors, but also the people we're going to, sometimes have the same deficits in our attention. And how do we handle that? So you spoke recently to these financial people, but I think what you're saying, and I guess I just wonder your thoughts on how do we become the informed consumer so that we find ourselves working with somebody who we feel is looking at the big picture and really not being sidetracked themselves. How does somebody try to do that?
Critical question. I think you have to differentiate a lot between a salesman and someone who is an educator. One of the things that my mother taught me early on in the business was that neither she, an experienced advisor, nor I had prophecy. And I remember when I first started in the business, I was pretty good with math. So people who are good at math often like to trade options. And so I started trading options. Like I was just out of stockbroker school, and I figured for my own account, I'll trade some options, and a terrible thing happened. I made money on my first few trades. And I thought I was like brilliant. I was ahead a few $1,000s, making more money trading my own account than working with clients. But the next week came and I lost a few thousand plus a lot more. And I looked over at my mother. Her and my feet were about 8 feet apart, and she started laughing at me when I put my head down in my hands. And she doesn't usually laugh at me. And I said, "What are you saying?" She says, "It's good you learned now before you got in any deep." And I think that's a critical lesson, is even the professionals, and when someone starts to tell you that he's got the investment that's going to do better and he can start quoting yields you're going to make on equity investments, you just walk away. Just talk to someone who's taking the time to listen to who you are and who wants to educate you to become better at managing your own situation.
That's helpful to hear from you. I want to integrate, because there's a question from Laura who in Los Angeles, and it ties in with a question I had, because one of the things I like about your book is that in using the chess metaphor, you talk about what people in their 20s when they're starting out, or 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, different life stages, and how you think about the big picture and the chessboard and how you make your moves. And Laura's question is, she says, have I waited too long to begin to save for retirement at age 50? if I haven't saved, where should I begin? So this question, I think, really relates, and maybe you can both respond to that question, but share maybe just, I love that developmental piece of some of what one needs to think about at these different life stages. And I think most of the people on the call are probably late 40s and over.
Yeah, very important question. And Laura, I have to say, it's something that I probably hear all the time. The fact is, it's never too late. And I'm not going to go through the whole compound interest calculator, but one of the things that people often think is they say, I have to save because when I'm 60 or 65, I'm going to retire. That's not the end of the story, because all of the money, it's not that the moment you turn in the key to your boss, all of a sudden you take all of your money and stick it in your mattress and live on that. You've got a long time, hopefully. Hopefully you'll live a good long life, and statistically, if you're 50 now, you're definitely going to be living into your 80s or 90s. Your portfolio doesn't just stop when you're 60. So first of all, absolutely you have to start those little tactics of putting aside savings in order to build up your nest egg. But don't just feel you only have 10 years. You've got a lot longer that even when you're not able to put money in, that money should still be growing for you in a broadly diversified portfolio. And one critical thing is to make sure that you have good financial hygiene at this stage. By this age, you have to make sure that you are no longer carrying credit card debt and the various loans that unfortunately a lot of people have. Make sure you wipe those out. And if you're not in a strong financial position, then you might have to make some serious cuts. But if you are earning okay, then take a close look at your budget and cut down enough so that you can really begin to sock away money into savings on a monthly basis.
Automated is a good idea, because that way you don't have to think about it each month and think about where else it could go. Decided for you. Helpful. What else? Are there other things to keep in mind when you're 50, 60, 70? I think Laura's question pertained to if you don't have any savings, and I think it is helpful to think about how you're spending the money and what you can do to either pay down the debt that you have. Or what about just in terms of thinking about your approach to the market when you're 50, 60, 70? Does that change? Should it change?
When you say your approach to the market, what do you mean?
Risk. You're taking risks in how you're diversified. How much is in stocks or bonds, or how you're dealing with your money, assuming you have some.
Got it. Okay. If you have none, so you're right, we can't really talk about the investment side of it, and then you just have to start with the savings component. But I think that the fear that a lot of people have about the stock market, which is totally warranted because it's crazy to watch the ups and downs all the time, but that's the key word, is watching it all the time. If you can step back, and again, this has to do with what we were discussing earlier, step back and get a little different perspective, a longer-term perspective, then it's okay to have some percentage of your portfolio at risk. Now, there's a few caveats to this. The most important one is to check your own personality, because guys like me and books like mine where we show charts and graphs of the market, you can get all excited about how much money you can make. But you need to listen to someone who says to you, but wait a second, it may not happen. How would you react? And so we refer to that as tolerance to risk. And if you don't have the tolerance to risk, then even though I can perhaps on paper show you it's a good idea to put money into growth mutual funds or work with managers or index funds, and we can talk about those specifics if you'd like. Even if those are a good idea, if you don't have the heart to stay in when the market is volatile, then it's not for you.
Mm-hmm. That ties into a question that Jerry from Boston has, which he wondered if you could elaborate more on your thoughts on the stocks and bonds index funds as a basis of core holdings.
Yes. One of the things that people always like to talk about is the fees associated with investing, and it's a critical topic, and I will give you the most incredible and obvious answer, which is clearly if you pay more in fees, you will have less money in the future. That being said, if you don't pay fees, that means you have to do everything on your own. And we always tell people that if you want to handle the portfolio on your own, you need to have the 3 T's. You need to have the time to do it. So if you're really busy with other stuff, like your job or your kids or your spouse, then maybe you don't have the time to be your own money manager. The second thing is you have to have the temperament. You have to be able to not let the sways and the news make you trade too often, because that'll also mess you up in a big way. So you have to have the time, the temperament, and you need to have the talent. I'd like to tell people that if you read our new book, that'll give you all the talent you need, but I'm not really sure. You really need to know what you're doing. And a great way to test yourself to see if you have the time, temperament, and talent is ask yourself, should or would someone else pay me to manage his portfolio? And if the answer is no, then maybe you really have to begin to ask yourself, should I be managing my own future? And so if the answer is no, then you're talking about paying a professional, and there are different ways of doing it, either using funds or funds or money managers or CSPs, that type of person to help you out. But the bottom line is, when you're doing that, to answer Terry's question, sorry, this was a long way to get back to the question. Certainly owning index funds in many ways is a cheaper way to do it, but there are certain risks, and we're a little bit tight on time, so I don't know if we should go too far into those risks, but yeah. I'm happy to discuss them. I'm also happy, Dory, to send you some links you could send out to people where I teach about this.
Okay. No, that would be great. We'll see if other questions about that come up, but I think the links that could go out with the recording information would probably be really helpful for people. I have another question from Janet from Indianapolis. She actually has a couple of questions, so maybe I'll integrate both, but let me start with one. She basically says, what source can you pay attention to? If not the news or financial sites, where should an investor focus? Where should we focus?
Listen, the news I'm a little more wary about. In other words, if you're going to do fundamental analysis, then you really need to look at the reports of the companies, right, which is hopefully more accurate than the interpretation of the news analysts. But it's always funny when people come into my office and say to me, Doug, I just read so-and-so who said the market is due to shoot up. And then I say, oh, that's interesting. By the way, the others said the market was about to crash. And I always get a kick out of seeing a lot of these major brokerage firms. They always have their bullish analyst and their bearish analyst. Whatever happens, they've always got some guy. So I'm a little bit cynical about that whole thing. But I think that if you want to do the research, then try and go as close to the source as possible. For example, if you're going to buy mutual funds, really do take a look at, don't just look at how many stars the fund has. Read the fact sheet in depth and skim through the prospectus to find the details that you feel are important, and then read them. And it shouldn't matter too much what's going to happen on a day-to-day basis. There's a great quote that Warren Buffett always says, that if you buy a stock, you should imagine you invest in this stock and they shut the stock market for the next 10 years. You be comfortable holding that company for that amount of time. And I don't really believe individuals should be trading individual stocks themselves, because they usually end up messing themselves up. But the principle here applies, which is look for real quality and don't get distracted by what's in the news.
That's very helpful. It is interesting because I know I have looked at those different sheets, and I must admit that I have not paid attention to the amount of time that it takes for a certain amount to accrue. And it's mind-boggling, really, to think about how you can look at something and not see it in front of you. But somehow it seems related to when you say look at the mutual funds. You really have to look at those sheets and pay attention to them.
It's the same way as when you walk into your kid's room and you say, look at this room. And he says, what are you talking about, Dad? It looks fine. You know, what, you don't see the tornado that just came through here? So everyone sees what he wants to see.
And we'll come back to that because I think there are a number of other questions in relation to it. But so Janet's second question was, does every family CEO need to have a CFO? Is it a smart strategy to build your team early?
Wow, what a good question. I always actually tell people there are two teams. You have the home team and your professional team. So the home team is going to be you and your spouse, or if it's a single-parent household, it'll be you. But you have to have someone who's going to help you out, because otherwise listen, clearly there are examples of people who handle it fine on their own. But in general, my experience has been, and maybe I've only met I don't want to say dysfunctional. I just mean normal people. In the 20-plus years I've been doing this, I meet people who really just need someone, at the very least, to bounce ideas off of, and more often they need someone to help them rein in their emotions and their concerns. So your home team is definitely going to be someone who's very close to you. And then your professional team, even if you're not going to work regularly with a financial advisor, which is fine. A lot of people don't need to have full-time CFP on their staff. Someone you can check in with once or twice a year and just say once a year, depending on your situation, can you just give me some feedback on what's going on? You sit with him for an hour and he helps you out. But along with that team, don't forget you need to have an insurance advisor, an insurance agent, because all too often people are either underinsured or improperly insured. You need to have an accountant, depending on your tax situation. And one of the biggest issues that people often face is they just don't have good legal advice, and so they die without a will, or their trust doesn't. Just yesterday, I got to tell you, I have a client, a huge estate, and I sat with her and I was reading over the trust, and I said, "You've told me what your goals are," because we've had many conversations. I said, "But your trust says exactly the opposite." And she looks up at me, and when she sees the words, she goes, "Oh my God." And it was really important to bring in professionals to help her out.
Can you expand on that a little bit more? Are you saying with this example that she had a vision or certain things stated, but how she was using or investing the money wasn't lining up, or what?
No, actually, the investments were fine. The investments were fine because I was taking care of them. But they seemed okay to me. I think I was doing a good job. But the legal, and I'm not a lawyer, by the way, and I always tell people that. I tell my clients, I'd like to read your legal documents not from the view of the lawyer, but lawyers are philosophers, and financial advisors, we're the guys on the ground to do the work. So when someone dies, it's up to us to handle. In other words, the trust then comes. They said, "Okay, do this." So we have to do something. So I like to see the documents when the clients are alive and well to make sure that whatever they've written is something that we could actually do. Nuts and bolts, we're able to handle the transactions. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen lawyers who write these contorted documents that I would have to ultimately interpret. And I tell the client, listen, if I don't understand it, it means your heirs are going to spend thousands of dollars in legal fees to try to interpret it. So I always like it when, and I'm talking about this team, but let the lawyers and the financial advisors or your investment people, let them work together. Again, not all the time, but just occasionally to meet or talk and make sure everyone understands what the client's real wishes are. And unfortunately, a lot of times professionals aren't as good a listener as they should be, and they make mistakes.
So it really is trying to stay focused, ask questions. But what are some techniques people can use to improve your ability to focus in? And I guess I like your differentiation between strategy and tactics, but how can we, listening in now to you, what are some things we can do to become better at this?
Certainly, I want to go back to the issue of being good at tactics. And the best way of, I think, getting better at tactics is to examine what you're doing very closely. For all of the people out there who don't keep a budget, for example. And again, I talk about it a lot, but I'm not a budget nut, right? I think keep track of your money so you know where it is. Unless you have a real problem, in which case you better make sure that every dollar that you have, every dollar should have a name on it where it goes. But basically your income is enough to cover your expenses. I'm okay if you're not writing down every last penny. That being said, it should be that at the end of the month, and this is something everyone can take away from this, at the end of the month, ask yourself, where did my money go? I earned $10,000 this month. Where is it? If you can't answer that question, then you've got to start digging in to the point where at the end of the next month, when you ask yourself, where did my money go? You could answer that question. That's one example, I think, of a real good technique to understand how you're spending money.
Do you think it's helpful for people to follow up on all these come-ons from credit card companies of transfer your money? And do you think that's a way that people should maneuver things, or what's your advice on that?
Oh, it sounds to me like you might have read that section in the book, because boy, do I.
Might be.
I turn out against it. People think that these credit card balance transfers are like a godsend, but it is a nightmare. There are so many reasons not to go transferring your credit balance from one to the other. And just starts with the fact that when people think that they're getting a low rate or a zero rate on the transfer, they have to realize that as soon as their 6-month honeymoon ends, they're going to be back at the high rate again. And what do you think happens during those 6 months when they're paying no interest? They're just accumulating more debt. So it's just worse when they get out of it. There are a whole bunch of reasons that you shouldn't do it. I come out strongly against it. I don't know how much time we have. I'm happy to discuss it, but it is in the book that we talk about really using your assets wisely in order to make sure that you don't get checkmated by the market.
Can you expand on that? I do really, and I said at the beginning, I really recommend this book. I've read it, and I'm trying to highlight some of the things from it that I think are, but there are so many things. But if you could elaborate on that, because really it's like, what are some of the techniques that you learn from these chess grandmasters? What are some of the things people should really start thinking about and be aware of?
Gary Kasparov was a former world champion and actually big in politics these days. And he made a great quote in the book, which I will keep on my desk. He said, "Winning is not a secret that belongs to a very few." He said, winning is something that we can learn by studying ourselves, studying the environment, and making ourselves ready for any challenge that is in front of us. And I really take that to heart, is this concept of studying. And one of the things that obviously he talks about in chess, but I'll talk about here, is building up your knowledge in terms of investing. But I think you have to do it in a way that you don't need to try to become an economist. It's always funny to me when people want to talk to me about currency exchanges. I say, do you really think you can predict which way, a currency is going to move? These are multi-trillion-dollar markets. And I find it funny that people think that. I think the knowledge that people can really get is the knowledge about themselves, which is in big part to do with their own risk tolerance and really understand how much risk you can have. And I'll give you another takeaway, a good way to do it. Let's say that you have $100,000 to invest. You've put away money in your 401k and you're retiring, so you're going to roll it to an IRA, which, by the way, is an idea I think is very important, but not to keep your money in a 401k plan when you're no longer with the company. And so now you decide to do it. And so you sit down with one of these fancy financial planning tools and you make a pie chart. And then you say, okay, good, I'll diversify this way. I'm never a big fan of these things because I don't think it gives you a realistic sense of understanding your situation. And the real question is, how much money can you lose? So when I sit with clients and discuss something like that, I'll say, listen, if you have $100,000 today, and the next statement you get, next month you open your envelope, and it's worth $84,000, what are you going to do? And there's the silence. And when you talk to someone about losing $16,000, that means a lot. That's a car. That means a lot more than some sort of aberration on a chart or a reallocation on a pie chart, which doesn't mean anything to any human being. So I like to make all of this human, and I think really knowing yourself is a critical first step, and asking yourself questions like this.
It's very helpful. Let me integrate another question from Janet right now from Indianapolis. She said, would you talk about how would you approach that? How important is knowledge about taxation and the tax system?
Yeah. I'll never say it's not important to know something because I think it is important. A lot of people, I think, worry about it too much, frankly, meaning it's just nothing they can do. Most Americans on their tax return take the standard deduction. That means that you're not itemizing it. So you're not really a lot of the other expenses that come up, they're totally irrelevant to you because you file with the standard deduction. So if you are one of the relatively few who itemizes deductions, so then talk to your accountant about being smart about that, and there are plenty of tools there. One of the areas, however, that I think really people could benefit from, and especially now, I'm glad that we're doing this at the end of the year, is take a look in your portfolio, and especially in the past couple of years when hopefully you made some money on your investments. And I'm only talking, by the way, about investments in your taxable account. This is not talking about IRAs or 401ks. But all too often, people are so excited that they made money in a stock or a mutual fund or an ETF, and they sell it. They want to tell people, hey, look at this, I made money. And I invested $10,000, I sold it for $18,000, and look how great I am. And what happens, of course, is now they have to pay tax on that $8,000. But what they didn't bother to do is they didn't bother to take a look in that same account and see that they also had a stock that didn't do so well, which they could have sold at the same time and taken that loss and offset the loss against the gain. There's a lot of behavioral finance reasons. There's psychological reasons why people don't do this. And also it was a great topic in the book. When Susan and I were talking about this very idea, she gave examples in chess and about how people they'll often be so proud of their winning position that they don't even think about the losers, and that's the losers that really get them. And the same way that if you have a loser in your portfolio, take a look at it, and if you sell it today, and again, check with your accountant for all the details of how to do it, but if you sell it today, you might be able to lower your tax bill.
What other psychological barriers do people seem to have? You're hitting on some really important ones, and what are other ones that are really important for us to be aware of, where we may be sabotaging ourselves and not even realizing it?
Yeah, I think sabotaging is
small question.
It's probably the perfect word to talk about. I'll tell you about a great conversation I had. There is a fantastic professor. His name is Daniel Kahneman. He's written a number of books. His most recent book was also a huge bestseller. He won the Nobel Prize in economics, even though he's not an economist. And he won it in behavioral finance, looking at why people do strange things. And I'll tell you a funny story about him, and then I'll tell you one of the things he told me. When Susan and I were working on the book, we had the chance to actually have lunch with Professor Kahneman and his wife and my son, in fact. And he was very interested in the work we were doing, and we're talking about all the research we had done. And I was so honored when he said to me, he said, "Doug, why don't you send me the chapter on behavioral finance? I'd like to take a look at it." What could be better, a Nobel Prize winner looking at the chapter of your book? So I was so excited. I sent him the chapter of our book on behavioral finance, and a couple of weeks later, he sends me an email back, and I figured he'd have some comments on it. But the only thing that he commented on, that he wanted to comment on, was the chess game, our chess analysis. And I realized that he was really interested in the chess, and I guess that means that we must have gotten the behavioral finance stuff right. So it was a lot of fun to get to work with him. But let me give you an example of one of the things he said that really messes people up. Is he spoke about how in investing, they often say that there are two main emotional motivators. There's greed and fear, and that people act based on greed or they act based on fear. Now, one of the things about that, I think, is that you need to understand which one's more important. So he spoke about a study. He said, let's say you flip a coin, you do a coin flipping study. Maybe, Dora, you and I can talk about this. If you and I flip a coin, and if you lose, we're just betting on the flip of a coin, you lose, you have to pay me $20. If you win, how much do you want to win in order to be willing to play this game with me?
I'm risk adverse, so I'd want to win $25. I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, so 20, in other words, good.
I'd want to win a little.
Okay, I don't know. That's a lot. I think that means that if we played this game, if we played this game 1,000 times, statistically you would win, and you would be doing great. It turns out you are actually very modest. Most people who play this game would demand in other words, to be willing to risk the $20 loss, they would want to win $40. So that's very interesting. They're so focused on that number, and statistically it doesn't make sense. It should be that if you were to win $21, then you're doing better. You're only risking 20 and you're making 21. There's a disproportionate way that people look at losing, which explains, by the way, why they end up often making a bad investment decision. And the answer is that their fear greatly outweighs their greed. Meaning they're so afraid, and this is why when the market falls, it keeps falling, because people keep selling. They're so afraid. They can't stomach the bad news. They live in fear, and people tend to invest much more based on their fear than based on their greed. And I'm not saying which is better, but I'm saying you have to understand where you're coming from, and that's what the behavioral finance people spend a lot of time studying.
Yeah, I think it's such an important area. We actually, on the call, have had other people speaking a little about it, and I think we can't think about it enough because there's just so many things that are just not necessarily conscious. And it ties into what you're talking about, the focusing, making things more conscious. That's really what part of what you're talking about. That can help you both invest better, but also just manage your money and have your money work for you better. Are there any other, I know you have 64 techniques, I think, or 65, 64 techniques from
one
the
for each
grand.
on the board.
So what are some other sort of important techniques from chess that are helpful for the listeners to be able to think about and take away from today?
I'll tell you something that Susan told me when we were playing a game. After a while in playing the game, I noticed that there were many ways that she was about to beat me. In other words, I was completely surrounded. It wasn't just a question that I walked into a bad neighborhood. It's that I walked into the middle of a war and I had no chance. Although she and I both started with the same number of pieces and we were working on the same board. And she pointed out to me that you need to have some sort of backup plan all the time. Every plan needs to have another plan going simultaneously. And I think that's very important for people, especially pensioners and people relying on some income stream. And I don't want to be a doomsayer, but if you've ever gotten that report from Social Security that says how much money you're going to get when you're retired, they mail this to people. If you don't get it, you can ask them for it. Do you ever read the first page where it mentions to you that they are going to run out of money during your lifetime and they're going to cut your benefits? Here you are thinking you're going to get, whatever, $2,000 a month, and they're telling you they're going to cut that. They're going to have to cut that unless there's some change. Now, we can talk about the politics all day because it's so nice to see, especially these days, how well the Democrats and the Republicans cooperate with each other on Capitol.
Absolutely.
And working for our benefit, and they're making sure that their own pensions come second to the pensions of the American people. And they're certainly not using a different healthcare system from the rest of us. So it's nice to know that they're going to work together to solve this. But let's just say it doesn't happen. Let's just say, for example, you live in Detroit, right, where they have to cut pensions. Or you're an American Airlines pilot which decided to terminate its pension plan a couple of years ago. Or you're one of the 68,000 Boeing employees who had their pensions frozen and the whole system was changed on them. What's the point? Again, by the way, I'm giving big names, and of course I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek about our politicians, who I love dearly. I'm reminded of that scene in Fiddler on the Roof where the fiddler goes to the rabbi and says, "Rabbi, is there a blessing for the czar?" And the rabbi says, "Yes. May God bless and keep the czar far away from us." So that's how I feel about the politicians. But the point is, all of these big names, and I'm telling you, which we have all listed in the book, are companies that people relied on, and people did not have a backup plan, and it didn't work out like they planned, and retirement was a very different story because they didn't prepare properly.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's the fear that, as you say, fear and greed, but I think the fear that so many people, probably many people on the call, are thinking about is just that issue of what do you do if you haven't prepared well and you don't want to outlive your money, and so you want to make the best decisions that you can now, even at this late stage, if we want to say it, if you haven't started and you're in your 60s or something.
Yeah, and listen, I think there's a perspective that people have to have on money that I don't know what our time is here, but I just think it's very important to go back to something we said in the beginning, and I'll tell you a little story about. Maybe it'll bring it home. About 15 years ago, I had the opportunity to hear a speech by a fellow named Howard Jonas, who was the head of a company called IDT. IDT was in the telecommunications industry. They gave AT&T a run for their money. It was a very serious billion-something dollar company. And Howard Jonas said during this speech, I got to tell you, I don't remember anything about the speech except this one point. He said that he and his wife gave 20% of their income to charity. And I remember being blown away by this. And I went home that night, and I turned to my wife, and I said, you know something? Let's try to be like them. And we made this radical commitment to start giving charity the way that Howard Jonas did. And one of the things then I began to realize as I was looking at some of my very successful clients is they all did the same thing. They were all 20% charity people. And the other thing that was fascinating about it was that they had a remarkably different view of money. They weren't the bean counters like we spoke about before. They saw it wasn't just how much money you have, it was the significance that you could then bring back. And they all said that every time things were going bad for them, they would increase the amount of charity they gave. And for whatever religious or karma reasons they believed, it made their situation better. And my psychological take on this is when you feel that you're in the position to be giving, it no longer feels like your money. You just have this great opportunity to help people. And I really believe that if you have food on the table today and you have a roof over your head, you have to realize there are 1 billion people on the planet who don't have that. And you could probably help them out. And I don't just mean you give $1 when you walk by. Become a person whose character is to be that generous. And I have never, ever once spoken to a person who said to me, "Oh, Doug, I regret that I gave more charity than I should have."
That's such a lovely way to think about it, and it seems particularly appropriate this time of the year as we're thinking about Thanksgiving and being aware of, as you're saying, the blessings that many of us have and those less fortunate, and it's the paying it forward that I think is really important to keep in perspective. This has been wonderful. I know that there's so many different parts of the book that I'd love you to keep talking about, but there's not time, so people are going to just have to buy the book, because you've got some sections on, I like your part about the strategy, where the STRAT are the specifics of how people begin to think about goal setting, their chess games that people will see, and then how both Doug and Susan help you learn from it. I really do recommend the book. One really quick, how did you meet Susan? I've been thinking that the whole time and wanted to ask you that.
So after I discovered that, I told you the story before about when the chess coach was asking me why I was not moving my bishop. And so I wrote down that was a little point about chess and investing, and then I started writing on scraps of paper every single thing that the chess coach said seemed to apply to financial planning. Susan Polgar, you should know, for those of you who aren't chess players, is a huge name in the world of chess. She broke through literally the glass ceiling of a male-only game, because it used to be a men's game, and she said, "I'm going to play with the men." And she made a joke. She said that she's never played a perfectly healthy man, because whenever she would finish playing with them, they'd always go, "Oh, I had a headache." She revolutionized the game, and so she's very well known. And I do a radio show, Goldstein on Gelt. Gelt is the Yiddish word for money. And I said to my producer, I'd like to talk to Susan Polgar, and he's great at getting people. So she and I spoke, and I asked her questions like the things we cover in the book. And it was like opening, she just had so many ideas, and we became friends. And to this day, we are having a good time working.
That's wonderful. I totally recommend the book. And Doug has also written the retirement planning book, and he has another book called The Expatriate Guide to Handling Money, and I think you have a couple of other books. Is that right?
Those are the most recent ones.
The most recent ones. And if you go to his website, which is www.richasaking.com, you can learn more about Doug, about Susan, order the book.
Even if you're not a chess player, you don't really need to be a chess player to read the book. It's the metaphor that we use to explain the ideas, but it's certainly not important to, you can do just fine without it.
So it's time to wrap up. Any last minute or last takeaway that you'd like people to have as we say goodbye for today?
Yeah, I think the number one thing is to, like we said before, is to focus on the tactics. I'd like to really stress this issue that I mentioned before about giving charity and increasing it, and to realize that it gives you a different view of money. And don't be a person who's counting money all the time for the sake of building the biggest tower. You want to be the person who builds wealth for the sake of being a significant person as you pass through this world. And I think that's, as you said, it's a really good lesson for this time of year, and I really hope that people walk away with that.
Great. Doug, thank you so much for being with us today. I really enjoyed talking with you, and hopefully maybe you'll come back another time, too.
I'd be honored. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you all, and thank you all so much for being here today and being able to listen to Doug. And thanks again, Doug. This was terrific. Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye.
Bye now.
You've been listening to Revolutionize Your Retirement Radio with Dr. Dorian Mintzer. To learn more about the resources mentioned on today's show, listen to past episodes, or download our free retirement transition guide, visit revolutionizeyourretirementradio.com.